Can I say what a pleasure it is to speak to the friends of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park again? And I remember one of the previous times I came to speak to you, which was at the Mariners Hotel, when I spoke about the history of Haverfordwest in 30 artifacts, and I was really impressed at the enthusiasm and the interest that you evidenced in that. So thank you so much for being such a great audience then, and I'm sure you will again tonight. So the title, Historic Ghosts and Legends of Pembrokeshire. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not that's up to you. But over the last 35 years that I've been researching all aspects of Pembrokeshire history, I've come across an extraordinary variety and richness of stories and tales and local mythology, if you like, about ghosts and legends. And it's a very, very rich theme indeed, going right back to the very beginnings of recorded history for our county of Pembrokeshire, getting on for more than 900 years. I suppose the point I'd like to make is people have experienced these things. They felt that they experienced them. So I'm not making any sort of value judgments as to the veracity of them, merely to record and disseminate these sort of pictures that have been captured on the pages of history. So if we go right back, tales of the supernatural, ghosts and hauntings and so forth, are actually as old as the written record in Pembrokeshire itself. Anyway, we have to go back to the great Giraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, or Gerald the Welshman. And as we all know, he was born at Manorbier in about 1146. He was a remarkable individual, one of the greatest figures in medieval Welsh history. Historian, cleric. He was the son of William de Barry of Manorbier, and he was a royal clerk to Henry II. And he was an extraordinarily assiduous writer, bit of a gossip, historian, travel writer. He accompanied Prince John to Ireland in 1185, and we're deeply indebted to Gerald of Wales because he left records like the description of Wales, the itinerary through Ireland, and he had a long and very productive life. Died at Hereford in 1223. And it's thanks to Gerald we have the very first tale of the supernatural. And he gives us a remarkable story of Simon, the irascible, red-haired steward of Stackpool. And I'm sure, like me, you love this place. It's Stackpool Elida or Stackpool Cheriton. It's got the most extraordinary feel and atmosphere to it. A typical Norman church with its long, tall, battlemented tower. And of course, inside, there's a real treat for lovers of church architecture because it's got the Lord Chapel, which is a truly remarkable feature of the church. But according to Gerald, the early Norman knight was Sir Elida de Stackpool, and he had his large estate. And one day his servant, the steward, who was the right-hand man of Sir Elida, sort of was replaced without any sort of knowledge by this chap called Simon, who was a red-haired individual. He was remarkably good at what he did. Never had the Lord's estates been so bountiful, never had the meals been so plentiful. He was almost sort of too good at his job. He seemed to know everybody's business, and even though his tenure was quite short, I think Gerald tells us that he was in post for about 40 days. There's a fair degree of suspicion rested upon this Simon. This was an intensely religious age, and he was known never to issue holy oaths, never go to church, which certainly would have been a very black mark against him. And eventually he started to exceed his authority, taking decisions without the Lord of the Manor's own views taken into account. So he exceeded his authority, and he was summoned to Elida de Stackpool. And basically Simon made a full and frank admission that his mother was a local woman and his father was a demon who had appeared in the guise of an individual. So he was the scion of a demon, which is a remarkable thing. Eventually Simon was seen. One of the last recorded glimpses of this chap was he was near a river talking to a very shadowy individual who could not be made out. And he eventually disappeared after a tenure of about 40 days. So this was the first ghost story in the history of Pembrokeshire. And Gerald continues in the same vein. Now, this is Orielton House, which is obviously not the Orielton House that I'm going to talk about, because this is a much later Georgian mansion, and we all know the Owens of Orielton were public servants in Pembrokeshire for many, many decades. Going back to the early 12th century or 13th century, then this would have been a much more different property kept by the Wiriats, and the chap that Gerald knew was Stephen Wiriat, and it was his singular misfortune to encounter the first poltergeist in the history of Pembrokeshire. This unclean spirit, as he's termed, knew everybody's business. It would throw dust in people's faces, it would issue curses and so forth. And I think in Welsh there's a term called bwgan. That's the sort of almost Welsh equivalent, but it would mock visitors to Stephen Wiriat. And of course they called in the church to perform an exorcism, but even the spirit even knew the clergy's secrets that they would rather not disclose. And so this exorcism failed, and eventually Stephen Wiriat, his estates were ruined. He was shunned, he was treated as a pariah, and he ended his days in a very, very sad and lonely situation because of the activities of this poltergeist in early 12th, 13th century Pembrokeshire. So that's a remarkable story of a poltergeist in Pembrokeshire in the early Middle Ages. This is one of my particular favourites, and I'm sure all of you know this building. This is now, I believe it's administered by the Landmark Trust, but this is Moncton Old Hall. It's a fine medieval building, and it's a stone's throw from Monkton Priory, which of course was founded in about 1098, just 5 years or so after the castle. And it's a fine building. It's got a wonderful ribbed barrel vaulted undercroft. And the reason why this is on the talk is it's remarkable, the stories that came from the vicar who was then living with his family at Moncton Old Hall. Now, today we live in a far more credulous age. You've got all these sort of sensational programs on social media, we've got it on television and so forth. But if you cast your minds back, you can imagine to the time of your parents or grandparents, 1934, society was far more conservative with a small c. Now, for a vicar in the Church of Wales, the Reverend Tudor Evans, to come up with stories of hauntings and the supernatural, well, you would imagine, given the gravitas and the social status of the vicar, then these would have been treated with considerable seriousness. And Reverend Tudor Evans gave interviews. He gave interviews to the local press, and I'm just reading now an excerpt. It even made the international press. The stories of the hauntings at Monkton Old Hall in October 1934 went international, or in today's parlance, they went viral. And I'm just going to read you the headlines. Mystery of the walled-up nun of Monkton Priory. The Reverend Mr. Evans tells of the ghostly knockings, the cowled spectre pacing sadly through the halls, and the centuries-old body of a woman who had been entombed alive. Now, if I tell you, those are quite sensational headlines, which I think you agree. If I tell you they weren't from the Western Telegraph or from the Western Mail, they were from the San Francisco Examiner. So that shows you just how viral this particular went. And the Reverend Tudor Evans disclosed about the heavy knocking on the door every night at 4 in the morning. And there was a room in the hall where a dog would refuse to go. It would cower and it would bark. And one day his daughter saw lights under the door. So she went in and she saw a cowled figure, possibly a nun, and she saw part of the figure looking through a window. There were lots and lots of other sightings and sounds, the rustling of long garments and so forth. And it was generally supposed, by way of explanation, that next door, literally a stone's throw, is Monkton Church. Now, this would have been the Priory, and when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1536, then it became the parish church for Monkton. And a rather gruesome discovery was made in the 19th century perhaps early 20th century, where they found the skeleton, a human skeleton, in the wall. And it's said that it was a female and that it was a nun who was walled up alive. Now that's it's impossible to attest to the veracity of that, but that is certainly a very gruesome discovery that was made almost next door to Moncton Old Hall. So that would make you think came from a member of the establishment of the the Church of Wales, the local vicar. So it would have been given considerable weight and credence on that account. Now, many moons ago, I worked at Keru Castle for the National Park, and I must admit it's my particular favourite in terms of Pembrokeshire castles, showing the transformation from a medieval castle to a beautiful Tudor country house by virtue of that wonderful long gallery, 150 feet long, and with those lovely mullioned windows, thanks to Sir John Perrott in the 1580s going up to 1592. And of course, two ghosts associated with Keru Castle. Here we've got a wonderful photograph of, a very early photograph actually, of Keru Castle in the 1860s. You can see that from the lady's dress, and that's the wonderful entrance to the Great Hall that was put in by Sirees Thomas when he acquired the castle in about 1480. Beautiful bathstone windows, fireplaces, and that lovely mullioned window with the coat of arms of Prince Arthur, the three shields beneath the window. But the lady that is supposed celebrated ghost associated with Keru Castle, of course, is that of Princess Nest, the Helen of Wales, who was born in about 1085, the daughter of Rhys ap Tudor, the last king of Deheubarth, and of course she was a mistress to Henry I. Remarkable life she had. She was abducted by Owen ap Cadwgan, and of course she married Gerald Fitzwalter, who was the Gerald of Windsor, and of course she was a very large family, and it's from her that the Fitzgeralds have descended. And the female ghost, the white figure of a lady that is generally supposed to haunt Keru Castle, is that of Princess Nest. She had quite a tragic life and a very eventful life, so perhaps she's still seeking some sort of solace that she never acquired in life itself. But perhaps the most celebrated ghost story associated with Keru, and it's certainly one of the very few that involves an animal rather than a human being, is the story of the Keru Ape. And of course, the story goes that in the early 17th century, the Keru family lost Keru Castle in 1480 when it was given to Sir Rhys ap Thomas, and then it was out of the family until the early 17th century, and a number of tenants took over the castle. One of them was Roland Reese, who seems to have appeared to have been the local tyrant. And one day, so the story goes, his son ran off, eloped with the daughter of a common merchant, and of course Roland Reese suspected that the merchant knew all about it and sort of enjoyed his discomfort, that Sir Roland Reese should, his son should run off with a common merchant and much his social inferior. So the story goes that he set the ape upon the merchant, who suffered terrible injuries. And as he was being conveyed from the castle, the merchant stated, issued a curse that Roland Reese should suffer in exactly the same way for his diabolical behaviour. And as the story goes, one night, just as the servants were locking up, terrible piercing screams came from the Great Hall in Keru Castle, where the ape had turned on its master and torn Roland Reese limb from limb. And then, of course, there was a fire as the drapes, all this great sort of things caught fire, and the ape disappeared. So it may sound far-fetched in terms of the presence of an ape in early 17th century Pembrokeshire, but I'm reminded of the archaeological excavations that took place in St Mary's Church in Haverfordwest in 1863. And one of the remarkable things they found was the skull of an ape, and that's in the early Middle Ages. So when you think that Haverfordwest, Pembroke and Tenby were major international ports, trading to the continental possessions of the English kings in France, also to the Balearic Islands, possibly even to northern Africa, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that exotic pets of that nature could indeed have been imported into Pembrokeshire, and certainly by the 17th century those trade routes were well established. I particularly like this photograph because this photograph is exactly coterminous with the story of the haunting at Manorbier. This probably shows soldiers of the 4th Welsh who are encamped around Manorbier Castle, because of course in 1914 we didn't know that there might be an attack on the coast of Pembrokeshire like there had been in 1797, and so this photograph shows an encampment where the car park is today in Manorbier, and at almost exactly the same time, then 1914, at night, obviously the soldiers were issued with live ammunition, and the sentry was near the castle, and a white translucent figure was approaching him. He challenged this person and received no reply. It's supposed that he fired a round from his rifle, which of course passed clean through the this figure, and of course then he ran in absolute abject terror. So that must have been a remarkable experience. But of course there are other ghosts associated with Manorbier, which of course was the boyhood home of Gerald Barry, born there in 1146. And I remember reading about the cases of piracy and smuggling. Manorbier Castle was a very favoured haunt for the smugglers, who would use its catacombs and tunnels and even the well of the castle to hide all sorts of illicit contraband. And I believe on one occasion, so I've been told, the skull of a juvenile, the body of a juvenile skeleton, was found in one of the passages, and he had suffered severe blunt trauma to his head. So that's a bit of a grisly story about Manorbier. Now, Stackpool Court, unfortunately, we've lost an awful lot of our built heritage in Pembrokeshire. And when Stackpool Court ended its days in 1963, demolished and ended as hardcore, either under the power station or one of the oil refineries that were being built in Pembrokeshire in the 1960s, then it's a great shame to think that such a massive and noble building was actually demolished. The Campbells acquired this in about 1698, and of course John Campbell acquired it in 1714, and it was the biggest building in Pembrokeshire. I think that building shown in the photograph dates from about 1735 or so, and then in 1782, of course, the limestone valleys were flooded, giving us the wonderful Boshiston lily ponds that we see and love and cherish today. But the ghost associated with Stackpool is a singularly strange one. It's supposed to be of a Lady Matthias. Now, I've tried to ascertain who this Lady Matthias was without success, but apparently she was a figure of a lady without a head. How she came to lose a head is rather intriguing, but she was supposed to have been doing a regular circuit from Tenby to Sampson Crossroads, which is at Stackpool, and she's been conveyed in a carriage with headless horses and a headless coach driver. Now, how that came to be, one doesn't know, but apparently the local vicar had an idea to exorcise and to save this spectre from doing its daily round. And he's supposed to have carried out an exorcism, and he condemned her to it sounds to me like the task of Sisyphus, because he told her to empty Boshiston lily ponds using a cockle shell as a ladle. Now that would, in my book, that would class as an absolute task without an end, truly an indeterminate task. And by that way, he managed to exorcise and get rid of the lady of Stackpool Court, so it's said. Another fine house, the original Bush House, which of course was the home of the Merrick family, burnt down in a disastrous fire in 1866. This one then, I believe this house was built somewhat later, in roughly about 1905. And like many other these great gentry houses in Pembrokeshire, the cost of maintenance and repairs was prohibitive, and eventually, sadly, it was no longer fit to be used as a gentry house, a common pattern across Pembrokeshire. So eventually the grounds were sold to the local education authority, and of course a secondary school was built. And then I was present actually in 1990 when it became a home. But obviously decades before that, the house wasn't used, and it was basically just used for like hostel accommodation. And a couple of interesting ghost stories associated with Bush House. A chap called David James, who was an 84-year-old gentleman, was walking outside and he encountered the ghost of a gamekeeper. He actually saw him for quite a distance before the gamekeeper actually disappeared near a small pond. But the best documented ghost stories associated with Bush House dates from 1955. And three men from, I think they were from the north of England, were in Bush House. They were doing various things. I think one of them was called Tony and the other was called Roy Hesketh, and George, his brother. And they were staying over in Bush House. Now, these were builders, they were no nonsense men and not easily frightened or spooked. And they were really perturbed by the doors and the strange rapping, and at night something would be like tugging on their blankets. They were very, very unnerved, and there were newspaper articles about this at the time in the 1950s. Sealyham Hospital, of course, is another interesting place. It was a mansion built by the Tucker Edwardses in the 18th century. And in 1923, it was bought by the Edward VII Memorial Association, which basically ran tuberculosis TB hospitals. And it was a TB hospital from 1923 to as late as 1954. And then the house was repurposed, I believe, for old people from 1955 until 1964. And of course, we know that in 1986, it became the centre of the outdoor pursuits, and it's a very successful enterprise, I believe. And a couple of ghost stories associated with this. One of them was the persistent sighting of a child, the ghost of a child, perhaps one who had succumbed to that awful scourge, which was so rampant in Wales, TB, unfortunately, because of the very poor housing that we had, poor housing stock. And the second one dates from much later on, when the chap, I think his name was called Partridge, and I believe he was Greg Partridge, I believe, 1986, and he was giving an account of the strange goings-on that took place at Sealyham, even much later on than that, in the 1980s. Coffin is a beautiful mansion not far from Roach. I think it was built by John Rees Stokes in about 1770. It's a lovely house. Later, I believe it was, I think the Massey family owned it. And this shows a wonderful scene of a gentry family on the front lawn in about 1905. Photograph was taken by David Bowen, a well-known photographer of Haverfordwest. And that's the same view today with its portico. And today it's a very high quality bed and breakfast. And it does events such as weddings and that sort of thing. But according to the account in the newspaper, 1905, a strange figure was seen distinctly walking across the lawn at the front, and it was seen by a number of different people. So it isn't just the flight of fancy of one individual. Seen in the front garden at Coffin Mansion, and then seen to disappear after about 150 yards or so. Now, this is another very fine Georgian house, and this is Little Milford. I'm sure we're all familiar with those lovely woods at Little Milford with the National Trust just above the Cleddau. And of course, it's difficult to imagine now that Little Milford and its environs was part of the industrial scene with the anthracite coal mining in Pembrokeshire in the, well, up until 1948, believe it or not. But it's a lovely house, and it's a fine Georgian house, 18th century, and it was owned by a man called Caesar Matthias, very, very interesting individual, very senior in society. I think he was High Sheriff of Pembrokeshire, and he had very extensive business interests. Well, so the story goes, one day he encountered a smuggler in a tunnel near Little Milford House. There was a struggle, and whether it was intentional or not, the smuggler was killed. And the story goes that for many years afterwards, Cool. Little Milford House, Caesar Matthias. This is Little Milford House today. But intriguingly, 1907, there was restoration to this house. And the local newspaper, The Guardian, carries a remarkable story of a chap who was working on the top floor and near the attic. And he was curious because he lifted the loft hatch. And in the attic, he found human bones. There was tools and a few base copper coins. And he thought no more of it, and he put the hatch back very furtively and carried on working in the room. Short while later, he was absolutely terrified because this white figure, a good 6.5 feet long, descended from the ceiling, and it stood beside him. So he was absolutely petrified, and according to the local newspaper, he ran out of the house, and he left his tools where they were and vowed never, ever to go back. So that's an interesting story, and local newspapers, even more modern ones, do disclose very interesting stories about Little Milford House. Now, St Bride's, I must confess, I've got a link with St Bride's because it was the home of the Edwards family, the Lord Kensingtons. They built the mansion, and of course they were there until 1920 when they sold it, and today, it's a holiday bond association, it's a timeshare. But my great-great aunt, Nell, was born in 1888, and she went into service in St Bride's when she was still a girl, when she was 12. So she went into service at 1900. And if I tell you, she only died in 1990. She died at the ripe old age of 102. And she clearly remembered, even 90 years later, the black mourning for Queen Victoria in January 1901, and there was a passageway in St Bride's where this tall, dark man, all dressed in black, was seen, and it terrified the servants. And of course, being told that as a 12-year-old girl, it certainly succeeded in terrifying her as well. So St Bride's, I'm not sure whether anyone who has a holiday accommodation there today has any experience of that, but it's certainly a ghost story that was very, very current around the turn of the 20th century. And of course, Newport Castle. Newport was the caput of the Fitzmartins. It was the barony of Kemys, and it's an ancient castle captured by the Welsh on a number of occasions, of course. But of course, today it is a private property. And the modern house, well, I say modern in a relative sense, the private house built within the precincts of the medieval fabric was built in 1859. And a good friend of mine, and I'm sure known to some of you, was Dilwyn Miles. Dilwyn Miles was the great Pembrokeshire historian who sadly passed away in 2007. And Dilwyn was a no-nonsense individual. My goodness me, he called a spade a spade. But I remember Dilwyn, you would imagine Dilwyn Miles would give very short shrift to any claims of the supernatural. But Dilwyn told me on more than one occasion that he would be in a room and you wouldn't see anything, but there would be this most intense fragrance of lavender would fill a room. So it was called the Lavender Lady of Newport Castle. And I remember talking to Dilwyn's late daughter, who was a very fine individual indeed. I remember Marilyn telling me also about the lavender, and so sometimes the supernatural isn't just on your eyes, it's on your other senses as well. And the Prairie ruins in Haverfordwest, this was the scene of excavations by Keru from 1983 to 1996, and it was the richest monastic house in Wales. Suppressed by Henry VIII in 1536, founded by the Fitztancreds in about 1200, and it was a wonderful medieval house. And Keru have found some remarkable finds, which are now in the Haverfordwest Town Museum. So if you ever get the chance, when we're allowed to open again, sadly we've been closed since 2019, but when we're open again, do pop up and see them. But there was a famous sighting even as late as 1976, where 3 men were walking up Union Hill, because of course the Union Workhouse was at the side of that very steep hill, and the lights were out. It was total darkness, and they saw these very strange, very, very intense luminous lights, and they were flickering actually within the ruins of the Augustinian Priory itself. So many ghost stories about the Augustinian Priory, and it was dissolved in 1536 when John Bathoe and only 5 monks left. And of course, when they were excavating, they actually uncovered the skeletons of a number of the brethren who were then given burials back on the site according to the Roman Catholic rites which they would have observed during their lifetime. And in the background, of course, we see the railway. That was the original railway bridge designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel himself, and which was replaced in the 1930s. And of course, it isn't just buildings that are haunted. This is the road from Lettston to Castle Morris, the crossroads. And I was reading an account the other day of people who would be loitering or talking at this juncture. There would be the sound of horses galloping furiously, and the sound of a vehicle like a coach being driven at great breakneck speed. And when you're standing on the crossroads, it would get louder and louder until it's almost upon you, and then almost pass you by, and then you hear the receding sound going dimmer and more echoing as it passes you, but you never see anything at all. And this is a fine church, Keru Cheriton Church. It's an unusual church for Pembrokeshire because the tower is so unusually large when compared to other church towers, built around 1500, and it's supposed that there's a great deal of West Country influence to that church. Today it's famous because it's got the tomb of St Nicholas de Carew, who died in 1311, and it's got the lovely Jacobean tomb of Sir John Carew, who died in 1637. But the tale I'm going to relate about this particular ancient building is much later, 1985. The Manpower Services Commission were tasked to clear the churchyard. And of course, in the 1980s, there was a great deal of unemployment, and these young lads mainly were given the task of cutting back the weeds and all the growth and so forth. One day it rained so precipitatively, they were rained off. And so the supervisor told them to wait into the church while he went to Pembroke to pick up something. When he came back, these lads were cowering in the porch. Now, these were no-nonsense individuals, quite tough, most of them, and they refused to go back into the church. It appears that they were loafing around the pews, probably not showing a great deal of respect, it has to be said, and they were laughing and joking, and their hilarity came to a sudden halt when there was the crashing of a door. And they couldn't see what had moved, and then there was the heavy, deliberate footsteps walking towards them on the wooden floors. Well, of course, they couldn't see anything, but the sound was sufficient for them to leave the church at great haste, and they were waiting in the porch for the supervisor to appear. So again, another tale that might make you think twice. And of course, we're fortunate in Pembrokeshire. We've got 13 Palmerston Follies. We have a, I won't say a love-hate relationship with the French, but in our history, we've feared that they might do us some mischief. So in the 1850s and 60s, under the called Palmerston Follies, there was a huge amount of works where Haven and all other parts of Britain were fortified in case Napoleon III chanced his arm and wanted to launch an invasion of Britain. So this is one of them, Fort Hubston, which was a fine building on the west side of Milford Haven. They started building it in 1860 and they finished it in 1863 at a cost of £55,000, which of course was a huge amount of money. It had you could mount 11 guns in the casemates, and then it had barrack accommodation for 250 men. And there's a very interesting story associated with Hubston Fort, because it was garrisoned by the Royal Artillery. And in May 1875, there was a terrible discovery. The officers went into the officers' mess, and they found one of their colleagues, Lieutenant Philip Carroll Walker, grievously injured with a knife sticking out of him. He was obviously he was in mortal danger. He'd been drinking heavily with some other individual called Surgeon Sidney Alder, and how the two men how Lieutenant Carroll came to be so injured was a question of considerable confusion. One minute, Lieutenant Carroll would say that, oh, it's nothing to do with Surgeon Alder. He had nothing to do with it. Don't hold this against him. And yet, in his delirium, the next moment he would say, he's done this to me. He has murdered me. Don't let him get away. So there was very considerable confusion. Sadly, after a short time, Lieutenant Philip Carroll Walker duly died of his injuries. And of course, there was a trial. There was a trial at the Shire Hall in Haverfordwest where some very celebrated individuals were involved, including the later Lord Halesbury, Lord Chancellor, and the surgeon was on trial on a capital charge. I believe the jury took about 2 hours, only 2 hours, to acquit him of murder, and so he was acquitted of murdering his colleague, Lieutenant Carroll Walker. And Lieutenant Walker was buried in Hubston churchyard. It's quite an unusual church because its medieval tower has been rather truncated, and that's a Victorian photograph. And even then, in the Victorian period, considerable legends associated with this incident, this terrible tragedy. It is, and there's two versions of it. One of them says that on the anniversary of his death, of his murder, possible murder, on the 26th of February, 1875, a dagger, the shape of a dagger, appears on the outside, on the base, on the shaft of the cross, almost a sort of a cry from the grave for justice. Now, my father is from Milford Haven, and he's 84. And when he was a lad, back in the 1930s and 40s, he was told, a slight variation, that on the anniversary of Lieutenant Carroll Walker's death, possible homicide, a cold handprint of a palm appears on the shaft of the cross. So there's two different versions of that tale, but it was celebrated almost after the court case itself. And that's an very early Victorian photograph of the churchyard in Hubston. Now, the Pembrokeshire's newspapers started publishing in 1844 with the Pembrokeshire Herald. Before that, you had to go to the Cambrian, which is published in Swansea. And the very first ghost story in the history of Pembrokeshire that I've come across is Haverfordwest in 1847. And this is the beautiful Georgian townhouse in the City Road, formerly known as Cokie Street in Haverfordwest. And as I say, it's the first ghost story ever published in Pembrokeshire in our local newspapers. And Captain Crowley was the name of the military gentleman who probably rented that house. And the story goes that one day a servant girl was in the parlour doing something, and she heard a tremendous rustling, almost like a wind, in the hall, outside. She went outside and saw nothing. And then before her very eyes, this monstrous figure almost appeared from out of the ground. And it was white, and it didn't have any eyes. So, of course, she screamed, which is an understandable human reaction, and then she promptly fainted. And, of course, other servants in other parts of the house rushed down to find out what this blood-curdling scream was, and even passers-by in City Road itself rushed into the house to see what that awful, terrible noise was. When she came to, she came and said what she had seen. There's been many interesting theories and speculations what that could have been. The only thing I would say is that when we had the terrible bubonic plague in 1652, which lasted for 8 months and which killed 20% of the population of Haverfordwest, then there was a pest house in City Road, but there was also a huge communal cemetery. They didn't bury people in individual plots. They were buried in huge mass graves. One of them was the Mayor's Field, and the other one was in City Road, behind City Road. And in fact, when they built the little supermarket in Haverfordwest in 2000, they even found some traces of human bones, probably from the 17th century plague. So that's the first ghost story in the history of Pembrokeshire. And I love this particular story because this looks like a modern building, but you know, appearances can be deceptive, because 59 High Street is an absolute gem. Many of you will remember that W.H. Smith had their Haverfordwest branch here. It opened in 1907, and it was there until 1989 when it removed to the Riverside Market, where of course it still is today. But behind the facade, we have an absolute gem. On the ground floor, we have a wonderful, wonderful, huge fireplace with 5 heraldic shields, probably heraldic shields relating to the Owens, the George Owen of Hentlys, and also the Voyle family. We think that in the Elizabethan period, this was the home of Morgan Voyle, who was an Elizabethan gentleman. At the back, we have an exceptional stone mullioned window, 5 lights, and I've spoken to some architectural historians who are very, very persuasive that this light window, you know, possibly even came from the Augustinian Priory. So when Henry VIII got his fingers on the Priory, this might have been taken out and reused in a domestic setting in Haverfordwest. And upstairs in 15 High Street, we've got a Jacobean fireplace, and you can see the date of 1614. So it's an absolutely wonderful, wonderful place. I must say that all of these wonderful features are now boxed in, so they're perfectly preserved and safe for future generations. But 15 High Street is a wonderful building, and it's a much, much more interesting building than the outside would suggest. But when it was used by W.H. Smith, I remember, most of you may remember the old Western Telegraph when it was a huge broadsheet newspaper, you know, and 1970s, I think it was 1973, the front page of the Western Telegraph, terrible experiences by members of staff who worked for W.H. Smith, especially when they went upstairs. There was 2 stories. There was downstairs, you had the newspapers and stuff, and then the bookstore was up a flight of steps. Terrible, cold experiences, and some people, even members of staff, even ran screaming out into the street because of their experiences. For some reason, history is recorded that it was a nunnery. There's never been a nunnery in Haverfordwest, and we don't think there was any religious house on that site. It was a domestic gentry house, a high-status gentry house. But certainly in the 1970s, staff working for W.H. Smith in Haverfordwest were very, very spooked out indeed by the sense of almost a sense of sort of claustrophobia and sudden ice cold chills which crept over them. And you may find this strange, but I thought I'd include this. Haverfordwest is a medieval town, one of the biggest towns in medieval Wales, if not the biggest. And under Haverfordwest, this was a photograph under Bridge Street in the 1950s. So you've got tunnels, and there's a lot of unexplored archaeology in Haverfordwest. It's really, really an intriguing town, and especially also leading from Haverfordwest Castle down into the town itself. Perhaps the most famous ghost story associated with Haverfordwest is the Lady of the Guile. Now, the Guile was the Stepney family owned a gentry house called Prendergast Place in Prendergast, not far from the church, and you can see at the top left Prendergast Place mansion house remains of. Well, this is the place in question. It was such a well-known ghost story that in 1866 there was a poem published in the local newspaper in memory to celebrate the White Lady of the Guile, supposed to be the wife of a royalist officer who went off to fight in the civil wars in the 1640s, and of course who never returned. She didn't know what happened to him. So after her death, her ghost haunts the area around Prendergast Place, looking, searching, yearning for her deceased husband who never returned to her in life. So the White Lady of the Guile, very well-known ghost story in Haverfordwest. Another gentry house, which is now, I think it's an assisted living, very fine establishment for assisted living, Bangerston House. And I think it was a chap called MacMaster who was the owner of shipbuilding and also, of course, sawmills in Pembroke. The MacMasters owned this, but before it was an assisted living facility, I know people who worked there, did sort of night shifts and so forth, very, very spooked out with lights going on, taps being turned on their own. And they were very, very sort of freaked out, especially if you were rotated to work at night. Bangerston Hall, which of course is just a mile or two outside Pembroke Dock. Lamphey Palace, place of enormous historical appeal. Of course, it was home of the bishops of St David's, when these churchmen were great landowners, not just, not just a sort of spiritual wealth. They had a great deal of temporal wealth as well. And of course, Bishop Henry de Gower was responsible for much of what's there at the moment. And there were 20 well-appointed rooms, very luxuriously fitted out. And today, of course, you can walk around Lamphey Bishop's Palace. It's in the care of Cadw, but I believe it's just an open site. And Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was executed by Elizabeth I in 1601, and he lived there. The Devereux lived there as a young lad in the 1580s. But of course, it's supposed to be haunted by the ghost. A white lady is supposed to haunt a Lamphey Bishop's Palace. Who she was, we'll never know. But there have been a number of sightings in the Bishop's Palace at Lamphey. And when you're there at dusk, sometimes, which I've been, and the bats are coming out, it's such an atmospheric place. You would imagine that anything is possible. And it isn't just the great mansions and ancient stately ruins that can be subject to ghosts. We also, of course, have public houses. There are many public houses and inns and hostelries which have celebrated stories of ghosts. I remember one old resident of Littlehaven telling me that before there was a mortuary, any bodies that were washed up at Littlehaven were invariably taken to the Castle Hotel, which of course is a very popular eating place and drinking place today. And a number of ghost stories associated with the Castle Hotel, the most famous of which was 1972, when I think the landlord was a man called Mr. John Gibson, and a lady, Mr. and Mrs. Ashe, were staying in one of the rooms, and they had a very disturbed night's sleep indeed, because they were woken up by the sound of creaking floorboards walking towards them, and they could see the handles of the doors were being sort of tried as well. So they spoke to the landlord, and he wasn't a bit surprised, and he conceded to them that they often had trouble in that room. And I know people who've worked in there as bar staff, and they've had incidents of sort of glasses being moved and that sort of thing as well. So makes you think about some of these things that are going on. And the Clay Lanes is just outside Haverfordwest. That's the wonderful sylvan area of Haverford St Isles, going over that lovely little road bridge. The mill is in the background, and the road that leads to Haverford St Isles Church, known popularly today as the Clay Lanes. Well, even as early as 1914, there were stories published in the local press, the Haverfordwest and Milford Haven Telegraph, that people in Haverfordwest, especially females, would refuse or be very reluctant to walk on the Clay Lanes at night because it had the reputation for being haunted. And a chap called Phillips is supposed to have seen a very strange panther-like figure outside Merlin's Bridge in the 1890s. So the Clay Lanes had a reputation for being haunted in the Edwardian period. And if you look at any modern social media sites, and there are a plethora of them, then it's supposed to even today have its very unappealing side as being the location of the supernatural. And indeed, ships can be haunted as well. I've known a great deal about the history of the Great Eastern. Of course, it was Brunel's greatest folly, if you can call it that. Although it was an engineering wonder, it was a financial catastrophe. It cost £732,000 to build, launched at the Napier Yard at Millwall in 1858, and it was a desperately unlucky ship. I can't imagine any ship that was so dogged by such bad luck. On its maiden voyage, there was a boiler explosion which killed 5 men. Numerous accidents and incidents and deaths and so forth. And perhaps the most persistent rumour, and that's a picture of the Great Eastern, when of course it was a white elephant. It had no use at all. It had been used as cable laying vessel, and then it was of no earthly use to anyone. So from 1874 to 1886, it was lying redundant, unemployed in Milford Haven until it was bought and sold on the Mersey as a floating fairground amusement. But there was a persistent rumour that when it was being constructed at the Napier Yard at Millwall, A riveter and his boy, the boy who would tend him, were entombed alive behind the metal plates. When you think the Great Eastern consumed 3 million rivets, you can imagine that, it would have taken a lot of riveting to do that. Whether that's true, I'm not sure, because in 1888-89, when it was broken up on the Mersey, and Henry Bath thought he'd make a killing when he bought the Great Eastern, well, it took him twice as long to break up the Great Eastern for the sum of its component parts. There's no record of the Great Eastern yielding the skeleton of a riveter and his young lad, but it certainly was a desperately unlucky ship. And even at Milford Haven, there were deaths. A young lad aged 14 fell to his death whilst cleaning the ship, and he was in the 1870s. And I mentioned about roads being haunted. Well, I think this must be the most haunted road in Pembrokeshire. This is the, I think it's the A4076, which links Milford Haven to Haverfordwest, outside Johnson. There have been literally numerous sightings of ghosts. You leave Milford Haven, you're heading towards Johnson, and you leave Johnson, and then you're getting towards Milford Haven, towards Stington, and on the left-hand side there's a place called Redstock, and especially when it's gloomy at night and the mists are swirling, there have been literally dozens and dozens of sightings of ghosts at that juncture. 1980, 2 individuals with another passenger saw it, all 3 together. And I went to Milford Haven Grammar School in the 1980s, and I remember people saying it even today. So, and even now there are sightings of, and it's always the same thing. It's always a man in typical attire of the 1930s with a raincoat and a hat, almost at an angle, running from the side of the road into the road. And you think you've hit somebody, you do an emergency stop, and there's nobody there. There've literally been absolutely dozens of sightings at that particular stretch, Redstock, between Johnson and Milford Haven. And sometimes the local press give us remarkable insights. This is Lambert of Elfrey, and in 1936, I would say this is the only example of a ghost panic that gripped the people of Lambert of Elfrey, published in the local newspaper. I think it was the Pembrokeshire Guardian, and it was said that numerous strange occurrings were seen in people's gardens, and 2 or 3 people saw the same things. In their back gardens, they saw strange faces peering into their kitchens and their parlours at night. And the local papers were so intrigued, they sent down a reporter to Lambert of Elfrey in the 1930s. When you leave Tenby and you're going towards Penally, you pass, it doesn't seem like a bridge, but this is Holloway Bridge. And in 1722, the mayor of Tenby, Thomas Athow, and his son murdered a kinsman by the name of George Merchant. There was a dispute over the sale of cattle, and they beat him to death with sticks. And he died a terrible death. It was said that his injuries would have killed 7 or 8 men. They bit off his nose and even tore off one of his testicles, which is a truly horrific thing to have done. And their ghosts, and perhaps the ghost of their victim, George Merchant, is said to have haunted Holloway Bridge, which is just outside Tenby today. And they were justly, well, if they did that level of execution, they were executed for their crimes in July 1723. It's near, on the Canterbury Road, near present-day Walworth in London. And that was a crime committed by a mayor, Thomas Athow of Tenby, which is remarkable. And of course, ships can be haunted, and this is HMS Asp, which was originally a paddle steam packet of 112 tons, bought by the Royal Navy, and it was employed on taking soundings in the haven. And it was commanded by Lieutenant, later Captain Aldridge, and it had a remarkable number of ghost stories attached to it. There was one of the cabins where there was the drawers would open on their own. There was rapping. There was terrible noises. Aldridge was advised of this when he took command of the vessel, but of course he poo-pooed it until he had experienced it himself. And strangely, it was whilst it was at anchor in Loreni that there was even more strange things where a female figure was seen on the paddle wheel. and later on it was in Pembroke Dockyard itself for repairs, and somebody saw a figure of a female in white on the paddle wheel, came off, and it walked towards the cemetery, and several saw it, and it went into a local graveyard attached to Pater Church Tower, and then mounted the grave and completely disappeared. And the ghost was traditionally explained to be that of a young lady who'd been murdered whilst it was employed by the post office, and the perpetrator was never held accountable. So that's the ghost of HMS Asp. And Poyston is a very fine house today, and this was the gentleman who once owned it. Now, he's quite a controversial figure, even more controversial figure today, because of course he was the governor of Trinidad. He tortured a 13-year-old girl called Luisa Calderon, and of course today he's very much seen as an egregious figure. I think they've taken his statue down from City Hall in Cardiff, and they took down the plaque in Haverfordwest. I don't know why they took the plaque down, because it only records the fact he was born there. It wasn't to his glory, just said that he was born there. But anyway, despite the current political confusion, political controversy, Thomas Picton's a hugely important figure, served in the Peninsular War, died at Waterloo, 18th of June 1815, the most senior British military casualty. Well, interestingly, in 1902, the High Sheriff of Pembrokeshire, Dr. Henry Owen, had a garden party, and for men only. He didn't like women. I don't know why, but anyway, it was for men only, and he was teased and questioned about this, and he almost seemed to disclose that he'd seen the ghost of Sir Thomas Picton in Moncton Hall, because of course it was the home of Sir Thomas Picton. We do have some interesting stories of poltergeists. One of them was of Castle Blythe, a remote hamlet in the western foothills of the Brussellies, and there were strange rappings. It was all centred around a servant girl called Marie, and there were strange rappings and a terrible noise coming from the dairy. When they went in, they saw a butter churn going end over end, and there was a brick inside it, but there was no sign of anyone actually turning the wheel. So the family got a bit fed up with this, and eventually it always seemed to happen when Marie was on duty. So very unfortunately, they gave her marching orders. Marie was dismissed, and that was the end of the poltergeist activity at Castle Blythe. Now, one of the strange phenomena that one encounters in Pembrokeshire ghosts and legends is that of a phantom funeral. You see a funeral before it's actually taken place, and one of them took place, involved Caer Salem Baptist Chapel at Kilgwyn. And it related to, and there's another famous one actually at Penally as well. But with this one, Mrs. Davis supposed to have seen her own funeral days before she actually died itself. She related to this to a family member, and it must have been to their absolute terror and horror that the premonition that Mrs. Davis actually saw of her own funeral came to pass, with the same people in the same positions and even the same personnel involved. Now, this chap, this is a friend of mine called Chris, he's very much alive, but this is the entrance to City Road Cemetery in Haverfordwest, and there was a very famous incident in 1981 where a number of people saw a large concourse of people gathered outside the cemetery, and it would have been at a time when no funeral would have been held, you know, getting dusk, and they saw all these people, and they saw a hearse and a coffin, and of course there was no such funeral taking place. It was a phantom funeral in the 1980s. Lovely painting of Castle Hall, which is just outside Haverfordwest. And a chap called John Pavin Phillips was very much a Victorian chronicler of the supernatural, and he records an incident of a man who lived at Castle Hall, that wonderful place that was sadly demolished in the 1930s by the Ministry of the War Department. And John Warlow owned Castle Hall, and one evening, on a very pleasant evening, he was at the beach, and he could hear the pounding of the oars, and he could see no sign of a rowing boat, and the noise of the keel getting onto the shingle, and again he saw nothing. But exactly the same time, several days later, and it was to the minute, he saw a boat being furiously rowed up the creek, up the inlet, and he actually saw the keel of the boat as it greeted the shingle, and it was the death. It was the body. They were conveying the corpse of a sailor from an East Indian merchant ship that was being taken for local burial. Now, there's a number of different churches that are actually Llanacefn and also Llanacaya, in which there are stories of phantom funerals. This one dates to about 1905, when a man called Dafydd came home to, because he was, this man called Dafydd was looking after a friend who was a GWR porter who'd come home from Cardiff because he was really ill. Actually, he was terminally ill, and he saw his friend's funeral a day before his friend even died. So it's a famous phantom funeral in the north of the county. And you know, one of the rich themes of history that have seldom been explored in Pembrokeshire is that of female wise women in Pembrokeshire. Now, these in 1900, Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas died in Haverfordwest, and I was intrigued that in her obituary she was described as a doctoress. Now, what on earth is a doctoress? She never went to medical school, and yet she was a wise woman. It was said that her mother and her grandmother had been wise women in their turn, people who had of innate knowledge of natural history. They would be there at the birth of a child. They'd be a midwife. They'd be there when someone had died. They would be the undertaker. So I think there's an enormous, rich, untapped theme of history in Pembrokeshire, in which the role of women in societies, hamlets, villages across Pembrokeshire deserves to be more, researched. And so they have a very central part, I think, and an increasingly important part in the legends and mythology of history in Pembrokeshire. And this is Prairie gone far. 1908, there was a remarkable scene where people saw a spire and even buildings in the sea, where they could not possibly be, and they were seen from a number of different locations, and even postmen on their rounds could see this remarkable optical illusion, which obviously it was. There was a photograph published recently, actually, of something similar, buildings in the sky which could not possibly be. But perhaps the best instance of this in Pembrokeshire mythology is the photograph of the spire of St Mary's Church in Tenby, and above it we see a ship which was actually being launched at that very moment from Pembroke Dockyard in Pembroke Dock. So obviously people in the past would not have any explanation as to that. They would give it a supernatural explanation. Of course, we have slightly different things ourselves. And in Pembrokeshire, we have an almost unrivaled fund of tumuli, we have cromlechs, we have standing stones. And this is the Veiled Lady, or the Lady Stone in Dinas, which stands not far off the main road. I think it's about 7 feet tall. And there was a legend that if you saw the Lady Stone and you didn't show some mark of respect, you took off your cap or you curtsied, then you would be in trouble and you would be dogged with bad luck if you didn't do that. So it's a 7 foot tall standing stone, probably dating from the Bronze Age. And perhaps one of the most enduring stories of Pembrokeshire is that of Adam de la Roche. Today, if you're lucky enough to go to Roche Castle when it reopens, it's a very fine building. I had a tour there a couple of years ago. And of course, built by Adam de la Roche, a young, headstrong knight, very cocky, very arrogant, who insulted the local witch, who prophesied his death within a year of the insult. Of course, on reflection, he thought it was a bad thing to do, so he locked himself up in the uppermost chamber of the house, of the castle rather, and on the night before the curse was lifted, he celebrated with a fine meal and brought in an extra faggot of wood to stoke up a large fire in celebration. But of course, unknown to him, an adder had secreted itself into the faggot of wood and escaped from the faggot and bit him whilst he was in bed, and so the prophecy of his death within 12 months was actually fulfilled. Some of you may know the Priory at Pill. It was Tyronian house. It was a daughter house of the main abbey at St Dogmell's, and it was a very, very small house indeed. It's been excavated and closed down, suppressed by Henry VIII in 1536. But I found a remarkable story published in 1807 where people were digging the well of the Priory in Haverfordwest during the Middle Ages. The monks found a huge brass tablet, and it was in a script, it was in a legend which nobody could work out. But eventually some scholar was consulted, and it said that in around the 18th century, in about 400 years' time, he said the town of Milford Haven, or this area, or Pill as they called it, would be a great and important port. So this was this tablet was one of prophecy that was dug up in the Middle Ages, and how singularly unfortunate it is that the tablet was lost and no one has seen it since. Wiseman's Bridge, I've just included this because there are many place names. If you want to know anything about the place names of Pembrokeshire, of Aberystwyth, published in 1992, where every place name, every field name is there. It's the most unimaginable tome of learning and scholarship. And I just put this: history is only as good as the knowledge that we have of it. We gather up the crumbs off history's table, and there is so much that is enigmatic, mysterious, unknown, and can never be known. So I've put this as who was the wise man? Was it a recluse on the shores above the beach going back centuries? I mean, I know there was a wise man family that were farming in that part of Pembrokeshire in the Middle Ages, but it still begs the question of the sort of the mysterious nature of many of the place names of Pembrokeshire, and they should take a part, and they have a role to play in the myths and legends of Pembrokeshire. We're coming towards the end now, I hasten to add. Obviously, being a coastal county, a tremendous amount of stories of shipwrecks and so forth. We've also got a great deal of mythology and folklore relating to sea creatures, mermaids especially. We've got Peregrine and the mermaid in St Dogmell's. He let her go from his nets, and she told him of an impending storm. He got home safely, and 18 fishermen from St Dogmell's perished in a storm of unusual ferocity and suddenness. And then, of course, we've got a mermaid at Carragwasted, another one at Porthrore, and we've got one at Aberbach, where the farmer wouldn't let her go at Trysaiselt Farm, and in revenge, she issued a curse that no child would be born at Trysaiselt Farm for 7 generations, which was apparently, so I'm told, was actually borne out in history. And even the mythology of a mer boy, witnessed by a man called Henry Reynolds of Pennerholt Farm. He was farming at Castle Martin and saw this strange figure where the water was very deep. A young man about 16 with strange coarse features, black tight curly hair. He ran back to the farmhouse to tell his wife, and of course, by the time he got back, the boy had disappeared. The top half, a torso of a boy, and the lower half was that of a fish, which must have been remarkable indeed. This is Kensington House, which today, sadly, is just a car park by St Mary's Church. The Kensington House gives the game away. Lord Kensington, or the Kensingtons, were MPs, and they owned a great deal. The MPs are a hugely important, influential family. And the legend goes that St Mary's Church, which now has a very short, squat tower, was crowned with a wooden tower clothed with lead. And you see it on the book print of 1748. But according to the legend, in 1802, Lady Kensington had a dreadful dream, a nightmare, we would say, in which the spire of St Mary's collapsed, and it crossed the very short road, this very, very narrow road between it and her townhouse, and the spire of St Mary's crashed onto Kensington House, and it destroyed their favoured townhouse when they were in town for the season. So the story goes, on the basis of a mere dream, she used her influence, or husband's influence, he was MP, to take the tower down off St Mary's Church, and it's only had that short, squat tower which it has to this very day. I mentioned this chap earlier. This is Sirees Thomas, born in 1449. Hugely important man. He was almost de facto King of Wales under the early Tudors. And of course, he was, this is his tomb. He was originally at the Grey Friars, but he was taken to St. Peter's Church in Carmarthen at the time of the dissolution. And he was basically running the show when, in the early Tudor period, he was made to swear an oath to Richard III that if Henry Tudor lands in Wales or anyone else who's singularly disaffected to Richard III, then he would only prosper and enter into the kingdom of England over his belly. So Rees ap Thomas was in a bit of a pickle on the 7th of August 1485 when Henry Tudor and his ragamuffin expeditionary force landed at Dale, because of course he'd sworn a holy oath, which of course would have been binding in those days. I believe the Bishop of St. David's had worked out a way of being able to for him to get out of the oath, but Rees ap Thomas decided that he couldn't. He would have to, literally carry out his oath to King Richard III, quite literally. So when Henry Tudor's army was marching over Mullock Bridge, which is just a couple of miles outside Dale, then he stood under Mullock Bridge as Henry VII marched over. And of course, it was Rees ap Thomas's support. Rees ap Thomas could have snuffed out Henry VII's invasion before it had begun. But he came to Henry's support, brought 500 men or so, and he was very important in winning the Battle of Bosworth for Henry Tudor. And for that reason, Henry rewarded him with the Garter. I believe he was the first Welshman to be given the Order of the Garter in about 1505. And of course, he owned Carew Castle and Larne, and he was a fabulously wealthy and important man. Some strange discoveries in Stainton. I've only got a few left, I promise you. Stainton, which is just outside Milford Haven, they were doing some excavations in 1883, and inside they found horses' skulls in the church, a pike head, and the thigh bone of a man of enormous size. So again, it's one of those mysteries that we may never know about, but it's the restoration of Stainton Church. And St. Thomas's Church has had 800 years of continuous Christian witness, and it only ended in August 2012 when the church was closed, and now it's been sold as a private family house. What enormous history! It's got the tomb of Richard Le Palmer, of a pilgrim in the church. But the reason why I've got that there is because there is a legend, a persistent legend, that there was an illicit marriage carried out in the 18th century between one of the brothers of George III, the Duke of York and Albany, and a descendant of the Stuarts, the rival pretending dynasty to the throne. That would have been a very, very serious, if not to say treasonable matter, because that would have been high treason, especially because the Stuarts were the antagonists of the Hanoverians. Well, I think I know why that is, because the marriage registers for St. Thomas's are all complete, except a couple of years worth in the 1700s have been torn out from the marriage register. So we're left dangling, we're left hanging. Was there an illicit, illegal marriage, a treasonable marriage carried out in the provinces in St. Thomas's Church in Haverfordwest? Why else would somebody tear out a couple of years worth of marriages from a book which in every other sense is complete? Now, this is an interesting document, isn't it? It's the death warrant of Charles I, and it's 59 names written. In fact, in some ways, they were almost signing their own death warrant. But Charles I was sentenced to death for causing the Civil War, an effusion of blood. And there is his execution outside the banqueting hall at Westminster on the 30th of January, 1649. And the reason why I've put that there is because one of the people who signed it, number 54, was Thomas Wogan, and he was locally born. He was MP for the Cardigan boroughs, and he was a colonel. He was a very, very sort of avowed parliamentarian. I think he was 52nd out of 59 actually, and he was well, they call them regicides, those that had participated in the murder or the execution, the judicial execution of Charles I, were the regicides. So when Charles II came to the throne in May 1660 at the Restoration, these were marked men. Those that hadn't died, some of them fled to New England, but many others were rounded up, a number were hanged, drawn and quartered, and we find Thomas Wogan was apprehended and he was imprisoned in the Clifford's Tower in York in 1664, but he escaped. And it was said that in 1666 he was in Utrecht in the Netherlands still plotting. So he was an unavowed parliamentarian. But where the legend originates, I know not. And this is my penultimate slide. But there was a legend that Thomas Wogan came back to the county of his birth. And he came back, he changed his name to a man named Drinkwater, and he ended his days in absolute penury, literally living in the porch, eking out a mendicant existence in Walwyn's Castle, and he died in the porch and was given a pauper's burial in an unmarked grave in Walwyn's Castle churchyard. So that's a strange story, and like many of these legends, you usually find there's a little kernel of truth to some of them, even if they are subject to a little bit of elaboration later on. And my last slide, and thank you for your patience, is a remarkable story dating from 1905. It's the Parog in Newport, as you will notice, and strange signs. People were seeing a figure of a woman standing on the surface of the sea. Absolutely remarkable. It was seen by fishermen as well, and it made, I think it was may have been either the Guardian or the County Echo that recorded this strange phenomenon of a figure, perfect silhouette of a woman seen on the sea, on the surface of the sea, from the land and also from fishermen as well. I think there's such a profundity of rich stories from Pembrokeshire that this little sort of snapshot, this is merely scratching the surface. It would populate it would populate an entire range of different talks. But there's something deeply interesting about the culture, the anthropology of all these sort of stories. Whether you believe them or not, as I said, that my introduction is up to you. But there is certainly something important and moving about the richness and the profound nature of the personal experiences from people who actually believe that they have experienced the supernatural. So thank you for your patience. I hope it was of interest to you. And with that, I am going to end the screen.
Really good. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So has anybody got any questions? If you have, please unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, can I ask one?
You're there, Ian. Good.
What happened there?
Simon,
I took it off.
Right.
Simon, that was fantastic. Can I just ask a simple question? How long does it take to compile a list of so many stories like that?
Well, it's taken many months indeed in order to be able to sort of, and as I say, you have to be judicious in terms of trying to get different kinds of things. So it's not all the same kind of story. It gives you a sort of flavour of the sort of the supernatural and of the legends. But as I said at the end, it's a hugely rich field. You could give a talk purely on the sort of mythology of the sort of the coastal, like the mermaids and stuff. There's a huge richness to it.
Yeah. Right, have we got any questions from anybody?
I'd like to ask one which is more to do with place names, if that's okay. I mean, Haverfordwest names, place names, Prendergast and Carteret, which Prendergast obviously has an Irish noble perhaps at the back, but I find these names again in other places in Pembrokeshire, and I wonder whether there is some meaning to them that would make them relevant to other villages where they also appear. That's Prendergast and Carteret.
Well, Prendergast, it's well known that Prendergast in Haverfordwest, which until 1840 was a completely separate parish. 1840, it was absorbed into Haverfordwest to make the fourth parish. But Prendergast was Maurice de Prendergast. He was one of the early Norman knights who went over to Ireland with Strongbow in 1169, and then they started interfering in Irish politics, which I suppose was, we still got that link today. So Prendergast is definitely, although you make a really good point, because of course there's also a Prendergast in Solva. Yes. So whether that's, to be honest with you, without looking, I would consult, as I said before, the 2-volume Bible of place names, B.G. Charles, and I'm still amazed at his capacity. He died when he was about 94, so perhaps he had a long life to do it. But that's something on my to-do list, to look into why there's a place in Solva called Prendergast, but the Haverfordwest Prendergast is definitely named after Maurice de Prendergast, who owned land in that area. When the Normans arrived in the sort of 12th century, they sort of divvied up the areas around, and he got that portion just north of the well, of course the Flemings founded Haverfordwest with Tancred or Tankard, and he was one of the sort of first generation of the sort of freebooters who came into Pembrokeshire as conquerors and took the land from the native Welsh. Cartlet, there was I'm just trying to think now. There's a Carthlet. There was a woman. There was a woman. The name was Cathin. There was a medieval family in Haverford called Cathan or Catan. So it's possible a corruption of their name, that the name of Cartlet comes from. Again, technically, it was actually outside Haverfordwest. It's roughly where the railway station is today.
I come from Prairie, and my house is called Cartlet, and there's a little farm down the road called Prendergast.
Oh, right, okay.
So there's some other explanation, I think, about this.
Well, of course, the river in Haverfordwest that flows under County Hall. County Hall is built in 2 parts, actually over the Cartlet Brook. So the Cartlet Brook, even today, flows right under County Hall.
Yes, we've seen it. Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Lovely. Have we got any more questions?
Oh, you're throwing it up. Finished. No. Yeah.
Any more questions out there? Going. Gone. Simon, I think you've blown us all away, and perhaps many of the audience have now gone to hide behind their seats in case anything happens. Apologies
for the few technical glitches.
Hey, no problem at all. They were probably poltergeists in your hard drive. Don't worry about it. I was fascinated by that, and thank you so much for all the effort and time you put into that. I particularly like the story of Moncton Hall and also the little Milford house. They really intrigued me. But I have to say, you brought a bit of levity to the whole thing at the end there with your story of Walwyn Castle Church and the man Drinkwater who lived his life.
I wasn't going to say it.
Outside. Well, of course, we all know of another Drinkwater who lives his life at penury as the chair of the Friends. But that's another story altogether. Simon, can I thank you on behalf of the Friends for that? Absolutely brilliant. We loved it. It's no wonder you're one of our most popular presenters. And now that we've got our clutches into you, we'll never let you go. So that's your life of penury forthcoming. But on behalf of all of us, thank you so much indeed for your time. Everybody else.